So our first speaker is Galina Antova. Galina is global head of industrial security services for Siemens Industry based in the United States. She leads the development of a portfolio of services for the protection of manufacturing sites against cyber attacks. Before joining Siemens, she was with IBM in Canada. And so please join me in welcoming Galina Antova.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Michael, for setting up the stage. I think that this was a very good intro to a lot of the topics that we'll be covering today. I think that we're lucky to have representation from three very important areas of this problem, that being the industrial control system vendors, the end users, and also the policymakers, because that is a problem that needs to be addressed from various different angles. So I would like to begin by staging the problem a little bit. So in the last couple of days, I'm sure you have heard the Internet of Things and Industry 4.0 at least a dozen times. What does that mean? And in particular, what does that mean for the manufacturing shop floor that we're trying to protect? In order to increase productivity, to be more flexible in production, and to be able to enable the next revolution of manufacturing, devices are getting more and more connected. That interconnectivity of the data allows for those benefits, but it also comes with a price. So the rising number and the complexity of the cybersecurity threats are something that is directly influencing how successful the Internet of Things and the Industry 4.0 initiative will be. We'll only be able to reap the benefits of that interconnectivity if we protect the data and if we protect the processes through which the data is running. So it's important to recognize that there needs to be a balance at the manufacturing shop floor between the need for increasing the production, the efficiency, and the flexibility, while we do that in a safe and a secure manner. And just to mention a couple of numbers that statisticians are throwing around, next year, in 2015, the world population will be about 7 billion, and we'll have about 25 billion connection points. So the question becomes, can we completely isolate our manufacturing shop floors in order to protect them? We can absolutely do our best. But that is not enough. We need to ensure that the data and the connections are secure. So with that in mind, to wake you up maybe a little bit, or to scare you, or to make you realize how important that topic is, let's talk a little bit about the global threat landscape and what does that mean. One of the main challenges that we've seen in the last few years is that the sophistication and the complexity of the attacks is growing exponentially, while the sophistication of the required skills for the bad actors is decreasing. And the reason I like this graph from IMT that has been thrown around the last few years and is very popular, I've seen it in many, many other presentations, is that the platforms the hackers have and how sophisticated the attacks are cannot even fit on graphs anymore. I mean, when you put together the threats of advanced persistent threats, the social engineering aspect, then it becomes pretty clear that there are multiple threat vectors from which we need to protect. It's not only industrial espionage, it's the script kiddies that can download a simple hacking platform and just for fun try to hack into a remote system, whether that's on the manufacturing shop floor or in the enterprise space, and then brag about it on Facebook or Twitter. That has huge implications for the way manufacturing runs their businesses. At the enterprise level, perhaps maybe the worst that can happen is if your system is infected, your mail server goes down, you don't have internet for 30 minutes, you can recover for that. If the manufacturing shop floor is infiltrated, the damage could be quite more substantial. Not only financially, but only for the downtime of the systems, and it has environmental hazard impacts as well. So while the bad actors are getting more efficient and effective in what they're doing, what are the policymakers doing to address those threats? So this is a global problem, and it needs to be addressed in a global way from a standards perspective. We have various standards that are addressing that from various different points, and what I would like to discuss next is how industrial control system vendors, the policymakers, and the end users can come together to start addressing that issue in a more structured way, because it's not just one company or one organization's problem, it's all of our problems to ensure that the manufacturing shop floor is secure. So with that, I would like to maybe describe a little bit what exactly do we mean by the manufacturing environment. Why is it so special? Why is it that we cannot just copy-paste solutions from the IT space and apply them to the manufacturing shop floor? And this is an important point to realize, because we need to bring the two parts of the organizations together. So I will start with talking about some of the characteristics that industrial control systems have, what are the challenges, and how we can potentially use that to our advantage to design some of the solutions that could address that challenge. So first of all, industrial control systems have very long life cycles. So this is not a PC in your office that you change every 2 years. Some of them stay in the customer sites for as long as 20, 25 years. What that means is that you have to continue with the firmware and the vendor support. Sometimes that could be challenging. Another aspect of that is, in a lot of cases, those are processes that need to run 24/7, sometimes for years. I was recently in a very interesting discussion where some of the end users were mentioning that they actually don't have any scheduled maintenance windows, nor they intend to have any. They're just going to run the process until it breaks. So that was an interesting perspective. So how do you patch if you're running 24/7 for years to come, right? So that is a significant challenge. Another issue is that the end users usually have a variety of vendors in their manufacturing shop floor. You've got different equipment for different purposes. That makes it challenging to know even what equipment they have in their shop floor, and how do you get visibility of the different patch levels that they have, and how do you do incident response on very different systems. Also, industrial control systems are highly customized. In a lot of cases, the engineers need to make changes. Sometimes you need to write custom things that fit into the specific process. That makes it very challenging when you want to make automated antivirus upgrades, etc. How do you automate that? And lastly but not least, most of them run on proprietary protocols. So how do you address that when you have an IT solution that does not address those proprietary protocols, because you cannot just do a copy-paste from the enterprise environment and copy that to the manufacturing shop floors. So those are all the challenges, and what do we do with them? Do we just say, well, that is too challenging, we're not going to do anything about security? I don't think that that is an option. It has never been an option, and I think that it's important to recognize that we as the industry, whether that's the end users, the manufacturers, or the policymakers, need to come together and take a leadership stand on that, on how we will address that, so that we can enable the Internet of Things. So what are some of the enablers? We talk about an environment that is diverse, but also that is a relatively static environment. We can take advantage of that static nature and employ some of the solutions that we can adjust from the enterprise space. It also has the built-in redundancy. We can leverage that high availability in order to do some of the online scanning and testing. Another aspect that keeps on being thrown out as a limiting factor is the fact that you cannot directly apply IT solutions to the shop floor. That is correct. You can still take the concepts and implement them in a different way and tweak them. What does that mean for the management of the manufacturing shop floor? manufacturers need to be able to establish a security baseline. In other words, they need to understand where the risks are coming from, and they need to be able, at a very minimum, to plug those holes. Whether that's with the support of their own organizations, or whether they look to the industrial control system vendors, etc. From there on, it's important to maintain that baseline, because security is not a one-time measure. It's not a patch that you put on and then you go and revisit it 2 years. This is something that you need to keep up to date. So with that in mind, let's take a step back and see how would a manufacturer deal with that challenge. And if we change the mindset from this being a humongous problem to us starting to address it with certain steps, then how can we change the mindset of some of the people that are coming together from a manufacturing perspective? So we usually have a plant manager that is responsible for the security of the plant, usually with a limited or non-existing budget for cybersecurity. So where that budget comes from? A lot of times you have an enterprise IT organization that is simply not allowed on the shop floor because they do not understand the specific challenges of that shop floor, even though they have best of intentions. So how do you ensure that you can help the people that are running the plant to have certain level of comfort and certain level of security in the processes that they're running? You also have the production manager, and his view on that is that, well, you can do anything and everything as long as it doesn't affect my productivity. Well, if there is an attack, productivity will be affected most likely. So rather than measuring security by the same yardstick of how much does that increase my productivity and my efficiency, the question should be, what if I just don't do anything about security? Is that acceptable? What are the risks if I'm to make that decision? I won't go through all of those, but I think that the point that I'm driving towards is that through the working together of the industrial control system vendors and the users and the policymakers, we need to come to a world where the enterprise side of the house starts working more closely with the shop floor to bring solutions that are applicable to both of those areas. In a lot of cases, we're seeing a specifically designed ICS cybersecurity team that usually is a virtual team that combines expertise from both industries. This is becoming more and more in the standards with a lot of the manufacturers. This is a very good start. Again, it's not enough, because the skills gap of people who understand security, and the people who understand security in the context of industrial automation on the shop floor is extremely limited. And one of the points that I'll address later on the policymakers is exactly that. We need to create more resources that are able to help with that gap. Now, what does that mean from the perspective of the three groups that I talked about? So you've got the policymakers, and Kit will talk a little bit more about that, who understand that they need to do a lot of structuring and standardization of the problem in order to push the industry in a certain direction. They cannot do that on their own. They can promote it, they can standardize it, but that is not enough. It takes the involvement of the industrial manufacturers as well as the involvement of the automation vendors. So if we look at the problem from those three angles, it becomes a little bit more manageable. And for example, in the United States, we already have a good example of that, I believe. So the NIST framework for critical protection of infrastructure was something that was released a few months ago. This was an executive order from President Obama over a year ago, because the government was recognizing the importance of protecting critical infrastructure. The protection of those critical infrastructure, whether those are manufacturing, utilities, etc., goes beyond just the pure manufacturing. It has much larger impacts. So we need to come together at this problem from various angles, and we all have very clear responsibility towards what needs to be achieved. So what is the role that each one of those players has? Few recommendations. Those are by no stretch of the imaginations extensive. Those are just some of the ones that we see really in the shop floor environment a lot. So first of all, standards are great only if they're adopted. So how do you incentivize the adoption of those standards, right? How do we ensure compliance with that standards? Some of the industries are regulated. For example, the utility space in the US has the NERC regulation, and so that you need to demonstrate compliance. The rest of them are not there yet. That's a discussion for a different topic. But again, something needs to be done to incentivize the manufacturer to move one step closer. I mean, it's very similar to your seat belts. 50 years ago, 40 years ago, people weren't using seat belts. They had to start getting incentivized for their own safety and security on how do you prevent disasters. And one point that I would really like to underline here is that policymakers, and I'm looking at Keith for this, really have a responsibility not just to put together the standards, but how do you also incentivize the educational institutions and the universities to put together programs that can actually educate the next generation, bringing together the ICS expertise together with the cybersecurity skills. I think this will take a little more conscious decision making rather than just waiting for those guys to be trained on the go. From an automation vendor perspective, right? Cybersecurity needs to be incorporated in all aspects of the product life cycle, from how the products are developed, to what are the application security measures that we take, to how do we service after that. And we have very clear responsibility to work with the policymakers to define those industry standards, because it's not something that could be dictated from government and regulators. They need to get the input from the vendors and from the end users. And finally, the end users, and this is very optimistic trends that we've been seeing, they're really getting together to share best practices within the industry. This helps them, but this also helps us in terms of knowing our customer needs and knowing what needs to be developed next. And I think that the end users also have responsibility towards the policymakers to express some of the challenges of implementation. I mean, the NIST framework and all of those standards, as nice as they are, they're just on paper. The real challenge comes when you have to implement that, and when you have to implement that in a brownfield facility where you cannot redesign everything from scratch. So how do you do that? Yes, skills is one aspect of it, but you also need to be able to have right technologies, etc. So I would like to close with actually one example that I think is a very successful collaboration between the policymakers, the end users, the vendors, integrators, etc. And that is the NIST cybersecurity framework that I mentioned earlier. It took, I believe, over a year and quite a lot of iterations to get to the final version of that. And it's one of the examples of how those three groups come together to address the issues of the industry. And I hope that we'll see a lot more examples such as this one, and a lot more collaboration in a lot more detailed ways to drive towards the adoption of cybersecurity in the manufacturing shop floor. And if I am to leave you with anything, I guess this will be the thought that all of the great topics that have been discussed in the last couple of days, and all of our aspirations for the future of manufacturing, that will be possible if we ensure that it's done in a safe and a secure way. And I think that this is something that we shouldn't forget. We should not compromise on that, because it's the fabric that's going to allow us to get the benefits of the other initiatives. Thank you.
Well, Galina, thank you. I like your three corners of the triangle, policymakers, automation vendors, and industrial manufacturers. And I wonder if I could ask for a show of hands as to who here associates themselves with the policymakers. a few. With automation vendors, a few more. So I'm going to say by default, the rest of us are industrial manufacturer community people, and academia and others that are focused on that. And I think we all have a learning curve to come up.